Michael did a great job of essentially kind of setting the stage for all of the various different things that CSA is doing and various different ways in which CSA is involved and has been involved implicitly or explicitly in what he calls a journey, an SDG journey. And I have to say, I think we're all on a bit of a journey with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the way I would portray things right now is that we've got a bit of a rules jungle out there. Some people call it an ecosystem. I'm calling it a jungle to indicate it's a little bit wild at the moment. It's not perfectly organized into a system the way you would might think with the words ecosystem. But it involves multiple levels, everything up to and including the UN, all the way down to individual companies, individuals, and everything in between, such as CSA, such as ISO, and so on. And it's quite confusing. And so therefore, I'm suggesting that it would be useful to kind of break things down into a taxonomy, a way of sorting these things out, which you see here listed as instruments, institutions, processes, and actors. And in the instruments category are things like standards and things like laws and things like the UN SDG goals. But I think we need to kind of unpack this a little bit more so that we can see the difference between these. And in that regard, in terms of my own journey, way back in the last century was when I first came into contact with the standard system. At the time, I worked for the federal government for the Office of Consumer Affairs. I was their Chief of Research and Senior Legal Policy Advisor in the Office of Consumer Affairs. And we had the idea that it would be useful to have a privacy law, a law to protect personal information of consumers. But there was not an appetite at that time within the federal government for there to be a law. So we were looking around for, was there anything else that we could do? And we came across the CSA, the Canadian Standards Organization, CSA. And we decided to develop a voluntary standard on personal information protection. And that involved a combination of government people, private sector people, civil society organizations through something called a matrix that ensured that there was a balance of people around the table, that there was a transparent process that was appropriately structured so that everybody had a voice, so that there were drafts that were developed and were the subject of consultation. And so that's what happened. And we ended up with a voluntary standard, which is what CSA does, voluntary standards. And it was published. And on the day that it was published, one of the major industry organizations in Canada then went to the federal government and provincial governments and said, we really think we should have a law. And we really think that the law should be based on this CSA standard. And long story short is that's exactly what happened. And so now there is a federal law pertaining to personal information protection, and it started off as a CSA voluntary standard. I bring that up because that for me was my awakening as to the incredible opportunities to do interesting things at the normative level, at the regulatory level, through other than law, but also how these voluntary standards can then be used in law and can be used by governments, both through law and otherwise. And just to let you know, the Canadian Standards Association is part of something called the National Standards System, NSS. And it in turn, represented through the Standards Council of Canada, participates in ISO things. And so what we have here is a system from the international level with ISO down to the national level through the National Standard System, down to individual standards development organizations such as CSA. And that's a way of linking up these three levels, international, national, and then down to individual standards development organizations such as the CSA Group. And that becomes very important when we look at the UN SDGs. Typically, the United Nations, which is an intergovernmental body, it's a way for governments around the world to get together, and they create intergovernmental agreements. The most common one that we've all heard of are treaties and conventions. And those require that governments around the world sign on to them, ratify them, put in place laws, all that sort of thing. And so the UN continues to do that. But they came up with something interesting and new earlier on in the 2000s. And that was, instead of coming up with treaties which set out specifically what we want governments to do, let's just set goals. And let's work with not just governments, but with the private sector and civil society to set those goals for the world, all at the same time. And we will therefore have a global set of goals that we're all trying to achieve at the same time. And that has taken the form, this is the second iteration. There was something called the Millennium Development Goals before there were the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but that is what we are now looking at. And what is fascinating about them is that they do not say exactly what it is anybody should be doing in order to achieve the goals. No poverty and climate protection and on and on. Nothing in the goals talks about exactly what it is people should be doing. They just say, these are the goals and here are the targets in terms of changes of behavior or changes in the environment that we want to achieve. And that is an innovation. And the reason why it's an innovation is because it excited people around the world to say, oh, if those are our goals by 2030, to have no poverty, to no hunger, no et cetera, I can do something about that, says a small organization in Ghana. I can do that, says a multinational organization in Switzerland. I can do that, says a government over here. Everybody and individuals and citizens and consumers and so on have all been able to say, you know what, I can fit into this. I can contribute to this. So it's created a great deal of excitement and a great deal of activity in pursuit of these goals. I call it the North Star effect because we're all now looking to the same set of goals. And that means we're working in synergy towards those goals instead of all heading off in all directions. And that's really fantastic. And so we're at this let all flowers bloom stage where there's just been this proliferation of exciting things going on around the world. You could call it the rite of spring or the riot of spring, just flowers, mosquitoes, animals, everything just blooming and reproducing like crazy. All great. And people are jumping onto different bandwagons saying, oh, I'm supporting this and I'm supporting that. It's also leading to a problem of SDG washing. And what do I mean by SDG washing? Well, it's where an organization is basically committing to doing something or saying they're doing something, but they're not actually making any meaningful contribution. So it's essentially window dressing. That's the challenge that we're facing at this particular point. A lot of exciting activity, but also a lot of opportunity for SDG washing. So what's the answer to SDG washing? The answer, we suggest, is more granular, detailed operationalization type of guidance. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a number of different sources. And a key source for that is governments. Governments through laws, environmental laws, health and safety laws, human rights laws, and through other policies, governments are at the center of the wheel in terms of addressing the SDGs. But they've discovered over a long course of time that it's best that government basically sets out the command, don't pollute, don't do this, human rights over here, don't violate human rights, and then leave the details to others. And a very important other are accredited standards organizations like ISO and CSA. The difference between an accredited organization like CSA and at the highest level of ISO is it means that there's a formal process with a balanced matrix of representation, a transparent opportunity for drafts of the standards and so on before they come out. And what that means is that at the end of the day, those standards and other instruments that come from CSA and ISO and Standards Council of Canada, those are credible. They're credible because they've come through a structured process that has support of all three of government, the private sector, and civil society. So I'm suggesting here that we adopt a sustainable governance lens in order to get to the goals of 2030. What do I mean by a sustainable governance lens? Sustainable governance says, in order to achieve the incredibly challenging environmental, social, and economic goals we face in the 21st century, which cross borders, are evolving quickly, technology is constantly changing, the only way we can do this is through a combination of government, the private sector, and civil society. Sometimes it's all about collaboration, and that's great. Sometimes it's also useful to have a bit of a check and balance or rivalrous dimension to it, and that induces innovation and competition, pushing us all to be better. So that's the sustainable governance lens that we're talking about. And in any particular country like Canada, the government of Canada is taking the SDGs developed at the global level, and then they are customizing them to fit the particular characteristics of Canada. And we have got unique characteristics as a country, geographic, societal, cultural, traditional, and so on, that are different from other countries. And so it's quite reasonable to think that the SDG strategy developed by the Canadian government is going to put more emphasis on certain SDGs than others, perhaps elaborate on certain things in ways that are not dealt with at the global level. And then that in turn creates the table, sets the table for a lot of the work being done at, for example, the standards level, which is the operationalization of these things. A big problem, though, is that none of the laws and none of the standards that have been developed so far were developed specifically with the SDG goals in mind. So they didn't say at the front of an environmental law or at the front of a particular CSA standard or ISO standard, it doesn't say this standard or this law is attempting to address this goal, poverty, reducing poverty, through this technique, which is what the SDG goals do. So we're at this particular point in time, we're in a little bit of a limbo mode, because we're essentially grafting on top of existing laws and existing standards, the SDG goals, targets, indicators, and so on. And then on a going forward basis, with all the new laws, the new standards and so on, we can do so explicitly. But for all of the existing body of laws and standards that are out there, it's a bit of a retrospective operation that's going on now as we identify which goals are supported, which targets, et cetera, are supported by which standards or which laws. But that's the path forward, is for us to do that, to label all of the existing standards and laws in terms of what goals and targets, et cetera, they are supporting, and then with all the new ones, building it explicitly into it from the time they are developed. And that's where I'll stop for today. And again, looking forward to your questions. And let me just say, it's been a real privilege and honor to work with the CSA Group and to work with my colleagues, Ruben from University of Guelph and Katie from Niagara College, as well as the people within the CSA Group. It's been a lot of fun and exciting to be part of it. Thank you.